The crisp October air carried the scent of fallen leaves as Blake Reynolds stepped out of the glass-walled skyscraper in downtown Boston. The morning meeting had gone exceptionally well, securing yet another multi-million-dollar property deal for Reynolds Developments. At 42, Blake had built an empire that dominated the East Coast real estate market, transforming forgotten neighborhoods into luxurious business districts and upscale residential complexes. "Mr. Reynolds, your car is waiting," his assistant, Meredith, reminded him while scrolling through his afternoon schedule. "You have an hour before the conference call with the Dubai investors." Blake nodded absently, his attention suddenly captured by a familiar profile at Harborview Cafe across the street. A woman with chestnut hair sat at an outdoor table, laughing as she helped a young boy with what appeared to be homework. Something about her graceful movements sent a jolt of recognition through him. "Sophia," he whispered, the name feeling foreign on his lips after nearly 6 years. Sophia Parker had been his most serious relationship, the only woman he'd ever proposed to. Their breakup had been bitter, with her walking away claiming they valued fundamentally different things in life. He'd buried himself in work afterward, expanding his company's reach and hardening his already calculating nature. "Sir?" Meredith prompted, noticing his distraction. "Give me a minute," Blake said, his eyes never leaving the cafe table. The boy sitting with Sophia was around 5 years old, with dark hair and a serious expression as he concentrated on his paper. Something about the child's profile, the way he furrowed his brow in concentration, sent an uncomfortable sensation through Blake's chest. The resemblance was uncanny, the same determined expression Blake had worn in childhood photos. For a fleeting moment, Blake considered walking over. But years of corporate negotiations had taught him never to enter a situation without preparation. Whatever this meant, it required careful handling. He turned away, sliding into his waiting black Bentley. "Take me back to the office," he instructed, his driver pushing away the unsettling thoughts. Reynolds Developments was finalizing the acquisition of the historic Wellington district, a project that would cement his legacy in Boston. Personal complications were not on his agenda. Hours later, Blake sat in his penthouse office reviewing blueprints when Meredith's voice came through the intercom. "Mr. Reynolds, there's a Sophia Parker here. She says it's urgent and personal." Blake froze, the morning's encounter suddenly crystallizing into something more significant. "Give me 2 minutes, then send her in." He quickly closed the Wellington district files, straightened his custom-tailored suit, and moved to the floor-to-ceiling windows that showcased the Boston skyline he'd helped reshape. The reflection showed the same Blake Reynolds that Boston magazine had featured in last month's Most Powerful Bostonians issue, confident, commanding, untouchable. Yet the unexpected arrival of Sophia had somehow disrupted his carefully constructed world. When the door opened, the woman who entered was both achingly familiar and strangely different from his memories. Sophia's eyes, those expressive hazel eyes that had once looked at him with love, now contained desperation and exhaustion. "Blake," she said, her voice strained, "I wouldn't be here if I had any other choice." Blake maintained his composed facade, gesturing to the seating area. "It's been a long time, Sophia. What brings you to my office after all these years?" She remained standing, clutching her handbag like a lifeline. "I saw you this morning outside the cafe. You saw us, didn't you?" "I noticed you, yes," he replied cautiously. "You were with a child." "With my son," she corrected, then after a painful pause added, "Our son." The words hung in the air between them. Blake's mind raced through calculations and possibilities, his expression betraying nothing of the earthquake happening within. "That's a significant claim," he finally said, his voice measured. "It's not a claim, Blake, it's a fact." Tears welled in her eyes. "His name is Nathan. He's 5 years old. I found out I was pregnant after we broke up." "And you didn't think I deserved to know?" The cold anger in his voice surprised even him. "You made it very clear what you wanted in life, and a family. Wasn't part of it. You were building an empire, remember? Nothing could stand in your way." Bitterness laced her words. "I was proud enough, or maybe foolish enough, to think we could manage without you." Blake leaned against his desk, studying her face for any sign of deception. His years in business had taught him to read people, to spot lies and manipulations. But Sophia had always been different, the one person he couldn't easily categorize or predict. "Why now?" he asked. "After 5 years of keeping him from me, why show up today?" Sophia's composure cracked. "Nathan is sick. He has Fanconi anemia, a rare blood disorder. We've been managing with treatments, but—" Her voice broke. "He needs specialized care that I can't afford anymore. I've sold everything, borrowed from everyone. I have nowhere else to turn." Blake felt his world tilting on its axis. The possibility of having a son, a sick son he'd never known, collided with his instinctive skepticism. Throughout his career, people had approached him for money under countless pretenses. Trust came neither easily nor often to Blake Reynolds. "I'll need a DNA test," he stated firmly. Pain flashed across Sophia's face. "Of course you would. The great Blake Reynolds, always needing proof, always suspecting ulterior motives." She reached into her bag and pulled out a folder. "I brought his medical records. You can see the treatments he's undergone, the specialists' reports." Blake took the folder but didn't open it. "I'll have my assistant schedule the test for tomorrow. In the meantime—" He paused, conflicting impulses warring within him. "In the meantime, I'll cover any immediate medical expenses." Just like that, Sophia's voice was hollow. "Throw money at the problem? Isn't that why you're here? For my financial help?" "I'm here because Nathan deserves a chance at life, and yes, that requires money I don't have. But I also thought, foolishly, it seems, that you might want to know your son." Blake stared at her, memories flooding back of their relationship, of Sophia's idealism, her community activism, her belief that life's value couldn't be measured in dollars. Those differences had ultimately driven them apart. "One step at a time," he said finally. "Let's confirm paternity, then discuss what happens next." As Sophia turned to leave, Blake found himself asking, "Where is he now?" "Nathan." Something softened in her expression. "With my sister, Emma. He has good days and bad days. Today was good enough for breakfast at our favorite cafe." She hesitated at the door. "He's smart, Blake. Brilliant with numbers. Obsessed with buildings? Sometimes it scares me how much he reminds me of you." After she left, Blake stood motionless in his office, the city lights beginning to illuminate the darkening sky. The Wellington District acquisition papers remained untouched on his desk, suddenly seeming less significant than they had that morning. He opened Sophia's folder and found himself looking at medical charts he barely understood, and, tucked between them, a school photograph of a solemn-faced boy with Blake's eyes looking back at him. 1 week after Sophia's unexpected appearance in his office, Blake sat in Dr. Eleanor Winter's private medical suite, awaiting the results of the DNA test. The sleek, minimalist waiting area reflected the exclusive nature of the practice, a place where Boston's elite sought discretion along with medical expertise. "The lab called with an update, Mr. Reynolds," Dr. Winters said as she entered the room. "There's been an unfortunate incident. A small fire in their processing facility has damaged several samples, including yours. We'll need to redo the test." Blake's jaw tightened. "How long?" "Another 10 days minimum. I've expedited the request, but quality can't be rushed." He nodded curtly, already reaching for his phone to reschedule meetings. The uncertainty was proving more disruptive than he'd anticipated. Despite his initial skepticism, he'd found himself studying Nathan's photograph each night, searching for resemblances that went beyond the superficial. "Mr. Reynolds," Dr. Winters added, "regardless of the DNA results, I've reviewed the medical files you provided. If this child is indeed suffering from Fanconi anemia, time is of the essence for certain treatments." "I'm covering his medical expenses already," Blake replied, rising to leave. "Sophia has my direct line if anything changes." Outside the medical building, Blake was halfway to his car when his phone rang. The caller ID showed Howard Mitchell, his chief legal counsel. "We have a situation with the Wellington District project," Howard said without preamble. "The community hearing didn't go as expected. There's organized opposition forming. Environmental concerns, historical preservation claims. They filed for an emergency injunction. Blake's day, already derailed, now threatened to become a complete disaster. Who's behind it? A coalition called Preserve Wellington Heart. Their spokesperson made quite an impression on the committee. She's scheduled for a television interview this afternoon, Channel 7, 4 o'clock. Hours later, Blake watched the interview from his office, his expression darkening as the camera revealed the coalition's articulate, passionate spokesperson, Sophia Parker. Wellington District isn't just real estate, she was saying. It's the historical and cultural heart of our community. The century-old oak, grove and community gardens have provided green space for generations of families. Reynolds Developments wants to replace this precious ecosystem with luxury condominiums that nobody in the existing community can afford. The interviewer nodded sympathetically. Reynolds Developments claims their project will create jobs and increase property values across the area. At what cost? Sophia countered. Displacement of current residents? Destruction of irreplaceable, natural resources. Some things have value beyond their price tag, a concept Mr. Reynolds has never quite grasped. Blake switched off the television, a strange mix of anger and admiration churning inside him. The Sophia before him now was the same passionate advocate he'd fallen for years ago, and the same idealist whose principles had created an unbridgeable gap between them. "Sir?" Meredith appeared at his door. "Massachusetts General Hospital. Called. They've admitted Nathan Parker for emergency treatment. Miss Parker asked if you could come." The hospital corridor was a far cry from Blake's usual environments. The antiseptic smell and harsh fluorescent lighting created a stark reality that no amount of wealth could soften. Blake found Sophia outside a treatment room, her face pale, with worry. "What happened?" he asked. His fever spiked suddenly. "They're transfusing him now." She looked up, surprise registering at his prompt arrival. "I wasn't sure you'd come." "Despite what you might think of me, Sophia, I'm not heartless." He hesitated. "Can I see him?" She nodded, leading him into the room where Nathan lay connected to monitors and IV lines. Awake but drowsy, the boy looked smaller and more vulnerable than in his photograph. Blake felt an unexpected tightness in his chest. "Nathan," Sophia said gently, "there's someone I'd like you to meet. This is Mr. Reynolds. He's a friend who wants to help you get better." The boy's eyes, unmistakably like Blake's own, studied him with a directness that was unsettling. "Are you the building maker? Mom has your buildings in her folder." Blake glanced at Sophia, who shrugged slightly. "I'm an architect and developer," he confirmed. "I design and build structures throughout the city." "I build too," Nathan said, his voice stronger than Blake expected. "Mostly with Legos, but sometimes with the blocks at school. My teacher says I'm spatially gifted." Despite everything, Blake found himself smiling. "I started with Legos myself. Still keep a set in my office for thinking through design problems." They talked for 15 minutes about buildings and bridges, Nathan becoming increasingly animated despite his condition. When the nurse came to adjust his medication, Blake and Sophia stepped into the hallway. "He's remarkable," Blake said quietly. "Yes, he is." Sophia's expression was a complex mixture of pride and sorrow. "The doctors say his condition is progressing faster than they expected. He needs a specialist, Dr. Martin Reeves at Johns Hopkins. But his treatment protocol—" "I'll arrange—" "It," Blake interrupted, "whatever he needs." "Just like that? No waiting for DNA confirmation?" "The test can catch up with us. I'm not going to waste time while he's suffering." Blake looked back toward Nathan's room. "Schedule the appointment with Reeves. My assistant will handle the details." Sophia studied him, seeming to see something that surprised her. "Thank you," she said finally. "I need to get back to him." Blake nodded. "I have a business matter I'd like to discuss with you when you have time." Her expression instantly hardened. "If this is about Wellington District—" "It is, and given that we're potentially co-parenting a child, I think we should find a way to communicate without television cameras involved." Sophia's phone buzzed. Before she could respond, she glanced at it, her expression shifting to alarm. "It's the hospital pharmacy." There's an insurance problem with Nathan's medication. Go, Blake said. I'll wait. Left alone in the sterile hallway, Blake found himself at a rare loss. His usual problem-solving methods, leveraging money, influence, or strategic pressure, seemed inadequate for the situation at hand. The complexity of potentially having a son, particularly one facing a life-threatening illness, was territory for which his business acumen had not prepared him. When Sophia returned 30 minutes later, her exhaustion was evident. Insurance, denial. They're claiming the treatment is experimental despite the doctor's insistence. Blake immediately pulled out his phone. What's the medication? Blake, you can't just name, dosage, pharmacy contact. His tone left no room for argument. She provided the details, watching as he made calls that cut through bureaucracy with practiced efficiency. Within 20 minutes, the problem was resolved. The hospital pharmacy would provide the medication immediately, with Blake's foundation covering all costs. How do you do that? Sophia asked, a note of reluctant admiration in her voice. The same way you organize community opposition to my projects, he replied. Leverage, relationships, and the occasional well-placed pressure. A ghost of a smile crossed her. Yes, we always did have different approaches. Blake checked his watch. I need to head back to the office. I have investors waiting. He hesitated. About Wellington District, I can't discuss it now, Sophia interrupted. Nathan needs me. I understand. But this conversation is postponed, not cancelled. He handed her a business card. My private number. Call any time, for anything he needs. As Blake walked toward the elevator, he heard Sophia call after him. Blake, he turned to see her standing in the hallway, looking both determined and uncertain. Tomorrow afternoon, Nathan has some tests scheduled. He'll be asking for you. He likes talking about buildings with someone who understands. Something shifted inside Blake, a sensation both foreign and strangely familiar. Text me the time. I'll be here. Driving back to his office, Blake found himself in unfamiliar emotional territory. The Wellington District project, worth over $500 million and poised to be the crown jewel of Reynolds Developments, was being threatened by the mother of the child who might be his son. The same woman who had rejected his proposal years ago was now inextricably linked to his future in ways he couldn't have imagined. As the Boston skyline came into view, Blake made a decision. He picked up his phone and called Howard Mitchell. I need complete background research on Fanconi anemia, all treatment options, and the top specialists worldwide. Then I want a full historical analysis of the Wellington District, not just the legal property records, but the cultural significance, community usage, everything. The opposition knows something about that land that we don't. Pulling into the underground garage of Reynolds Tower, Blake realized he'd made another decision without consciously acknowledging it. He would be returning to the hospital tomorrow, DNA results or not. 6 weeks had passed since Blake first spotted Sophia and Nathan at the Harborview Cafe. What began as occasional hospital visits had evolved into a regular presence in the boy's life. Blake found himself rearranging meetings and conference calls, something previously unthinkable, to spend afternoons helping Nathan with his increasingly ambitious Lego projects. Today, they were tackling a miniature replica of the Boston Public Library, with Sophia occasionally glancing up from her laptop where she worked nearby. The hospital room had transformed over the weeks, now featuring Nathan's architectural drawings pinned to the walls and engineering books Blake had brought stacked on the windowsill. The symmetry is important, Blake explained, helping Nathan position the tiny columns. Balance in classical architecture creates a sense of permanence and strength. Nathan nodded seriously, his small fingers surprisingly dexterous despite the IV line in his arm. Like in math equations, both sides have to balance. Blake felt that now familiar surge of pride mixed with wonder. The boy's intuitive understanding of structural principles reminded him intensely of his own childhood obsessions. Exactly. Architecture is applied mathematics, beauty through precision. Sophia closed her laptop with a soft click. Nathan's math teacher sent an email yesterday. Apparently he's been explaining load-bearing principles to his classmates. They didn't understand why the tower kept falling. Nathan said without looking up from his work. They needed to distribute the weight correctly. Blake caught Sophia's eye over the boy's head, sharing a moment of parental pride that felt both natural and surreal. These moments had been increasing, brief connections where their shared concern for Nathan temporarily bridged the chasm of their differences. The new DNA samples had been processed weeks ago, confirming what Blake had already accepted. Nathan was unquestionably his son. The official confirmation had changed little in Blake's growing commitment to the boy, but had transformed his legal approach. His team had quietly filed for partial custody while simultaneously fast-tracking Nathan's addition to his health insurance, trust funds and corporate succession plans. "Mr. Reynolds?" A nurse appeared at the doorway. "Dr. Reeves would like to speak with both parents." In the consultation room, Martin Reeves' usual confident demeanor seemed subdued. The specialist had been managing Nathan's care for 3 weeks, implementing an aggressive treatment protocol funded by Blake. "Nathan's response to the current treatment is not what we'd hoped," Reeves began, his voice measured. "The disease is progressing despite our interventions." Blake felt Sophia stiffen beside him. His hand moved instinctively to cover hers on the table between them, a gesture of support that would have been unimaginable weeks earlier. "What are our options?" Blake asked, falling back on his business approach to problem solving. Identify obstacles, find solutions, implement decisively. "There's an experimental treatment program at the Mayo Clinic," Reeves explained. "Highly specialized gene therapy combined with a stem cell approach. It's showing promising results in cases similar to Nathan's." "Then we'll do that," Blake stated firmly. Dr. Reeves hesitated. "It's not that simple. The program has limited openings, strict qualification criteria, and cost isn't an issue," Blake interrupted. "It's not just about money, Mr. Reynolds. The treatment requires a genetically compatible donor for the stem cell component. Siblings are typically the best match, but—" "Nathan doesn't have siblings," Sophia finished quietly. "Parents are sometimes compatible, though not ideal. We should test both of you immediately." Back in Nathan's room, they found him asleep, the half-finished library model still on his bedside table. Blake studied his son's face, the dark lashes against pale cheeks, the determined set of his jaw even in sleep. "He looks like your father," Sophia said quietly, noticing Blake's gaze. "I saw photos in old newspaper clippings when I was researching Reynolds' developments for the Wellington campaign." Blake turned to her, surprised. "You researched my family?" "No, your opponent's history," she replied with a slight shrug. "Your grandfather, Theodore Reynolds, was quite different from the company's current image. He built affordable housing after World War II, established community centers in his developments." "That was a different era in construction," Blake said defensively. "Was it? Or was it a different philosophy about what construction should serve?" Sophia challenged, though her tone remained gentle. "The Wellington district was one of his projects. Did you know that? The community gardens were his initiative." Blake felt a strange uneasiness. His grandfather had been gone for 20 years, but the company archives contained his journals and planning documents, materials Blake had skimmed but never deeply examined, focused as he was on modernization and expansion. "How do you know all this? Public records, community oral histories. The older residents remember Theodore Reynolds as a builder who cared about creating neighborhoods, not just properties." Sophia looked at Nathan, sleeping peacefully. "It's actually why I agreed to meet you years ago, when we were first introduced at that charity event. I'd heard stories about your grandfather and thought perhaps—" She didn't finish, but Blake understood. She'd hoped he carried his grandfather's values beneath his corporate exterior. Their relationship had proved otherwise. "I have a meeting with the Wellington community representatives tomorrow," Blake said, changing the subject. "Will you be there?" As the coalition spokesperson, yes. Sophia studied him. "Are you going to try to buy them off? It won't work. Some things matter more than money." "So you've always told me," Blake replied without rancor. "I'd like to propose we meet privately beforehand. There might be a way forward that addresses both your concerns and my development needs." Sophia looked skeptical, but nodded. "Neutral territory, the Athenaeum Library at 10. The following morning, Blake arrived at the historic library with an attaché case containing documents he'd spent half the night reviewing. Sophia was already there, seated at a quiet corner table. "I asked my team to look into the historical significance of the Wellington district," Blake began, laying out several old maps and photographs. "They found something interesting in my grandfather's original plans." Sophia leaned forward, examining the yellowed sketches with obvious interest. The oak grove and gardens weren't accidental features. They were deliberately preserved around a natural spring that once supplied water to the neighborhood. Blake pointed to architectural drawings. "The spring is still there, though capped decades ago when city water became available." "The community has been saying Wellington has historical significance," Sophia said. "This confirms it." "Yes, but it does more than that." Blake pulled out a modern rendering. "It gives us a way to redesign the project entirely. A development that preserves the historical core while still creating the housing and commercial space the city needs." For nearly 2 hours, they discussed possibilities, arguing points respectfully but intensely. Blake found himself engaged in a way corporate negotiations rarely achieved. Sophia challenged his assumptions, pushed his creativity, and actually listened when he explained financial constraints. "This could work," she admitted finally, studying the compromise design they'd sketched together. "The coalition would need assurances about affordable housing percentages and preservation of the gardens. I'll put it in writing," Blake promised, "and I'd like you to consult on the historical elements of the design." Sophia looked up sharply. "You're offering me a job? I'm offering a collaboration. You understand something about community value that my team has overlooked." He hesitated. "And frankly, I could use someone who isn't afraid to tell me when I'm wrong." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "You've never handled criticism well." "Dumbass." "Learning," he admitted. "Having a 5-year-old question your architectural decisions is surprisingly humbling." The moment of shared amusement faded as Sophia checked her phone. "The hospital called while we were talking. Nathan's running a fever again." Blake was already gathering the documents. "I'll drive us there." At the hospital, they found Nathan in good spirits despite his elevated temperature. Dr. Reeves met them with unexpected news. "We've received the compatibility test results," he said. "Mr. Reynolds, you're a potential stem cell donor match for Nathan. Not perfect, but workable. Ms. Parker, unfortunately, you're not compatible." "What does this mean for the Mayo Clinic program?" Blake asked. "It significantly improves Nathan's candidacy. I've already submitted the application with the test results. We should hear back within days." That evening, after Nathan had fallen asleep, Blake and Sophia sat in the hospital cafeteria, both exhausted but reluctant to leave. "He'd have to relocate to Minnesota for the treatment," Sophia said, breaking the silence. 3 to 6 months, they said. Blake nodded. "I've already looked into housing near the clinic. There's a furnished executive apartment available that would accommodate all 3 of us comfortably." Sophia looked up from her coffee. "All 3? I'm the donor, Sophia. I'll need to be there. And obviously you'll be with Nathan." He stated this as simple fact. "My company can be managed remotely for a few months." Just like that, the great Blake Reynolds putting business second? There was no malice in her question, only genuine curiosity about the transformation she was witnessing. "Nathan changes everything," Blake said simply. "I'm still processing what that means long term. But for now it means Minnesota." Sophia studied him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "When we were together, you canceled our vacation to Italy because a zoning meeting came up. You said nothing was more important than being present for key business decisions." "I remember," Blake acknowledged. "I was wrong about many things back then. The question is," Sophia said softly, "what are you right about now? This new Blake who designs community-friendly developments and rearranges his empire for hospital visits. Is he real, or is he temporary?" The question hit Blake with unexpected force. He'd been so focused on immediate problems, Nathan's health, the Wellington redesign, the logistics of treatment, that he hadn't fully examined the profound shift occurring within himself. "I don't know," he answered honestly, "but I'd like the chance to find out." Their conversation was interrupted by Blake's phone. The Mayo Clinic was calling with news that would accelerate all their plans. Nathan had been accepted into the treatment program with an opening available immediately. The fragile new understanding between Blake and Sophia was about to face its greatest test, far from the familiar territory of Boston, with their son's life hanging in the balance. The Rochester winter had settled in early, blanketing the landscape, around the Mayo Clinic with pristine snow. From the wall-to-ceiling windows of their temporary apartment, Blake watched as flurries danced in the glow of street lamps. Behind him, Sophia moved quietly through the living space, preparing Nathan's evening medications. 3 months had passed since they'd relocated to Minnesota for Nathan's treatment. The sleek executive apartment had gradually transformed. Nathan's architectural drawings covered the refrigerator. Sophia's research papers cluttered the dining table, and Blake's makeshift office occupied one corner of the living room. What had begun as a sterile temporary space now bore the unmistakable markers of a family home. "Nathan's asking for you," Sophia said, interrupting Blake's thoughts. "He wants to show you the progress on his city design." Blake nodded, setting aside the tablet where he'd been reviewing the Wellington district revisions. The redesigned project had gained unexpected momentum in Boston with community support, transforming potential disaster into a showcase development. Howard Mitchell had been managing the daily operations admirably in Blake's absence, though Blake still participated in major decisions via video conference. In Nathan's bedroom, elaborate, paper structures covered every surface. During the weeks of intense treatment, when physical activities were limited, Blake had introduced his son to urban planning concepts. Nathan had embraced the challenge with remarkable enthusiasm, creating an entire miniature city complete with parks, transportation systems, and mixed-use buildings. "I fixed the drainage problem," Nathan explained, pointing to a cleverly designed system of channels beneath the city model. "The water flows to the central park where it becomes a feature instead of a problem." "Brilliant," Blake acknowledged, genuinely impressed. "Converting a challenge into an asset, that's the essence of good design." Nathan beamed at the praise, though the smile couldn't disguise his thinness or the dark circles beneath his eyes. The treatment protocol had been brutal, with the stem cell transplant from Blake followed by aggressive therapy that left the boy exhausted and sometimes in pain. Yet Nathan's resilience continued to amaze both parents. He worked on his city designs even on the worst days, his determination unwavering. "Dr. Larson says I can go to the clinic garden tomorrow if my blood counts stay up," Nathan said hopefully. "Could we bring my city model to show her? She said she used to be an engineer before becoming a doctor." "If you're feeling strong enough, absolutely," Blake promised, straightening a tiny lamppost that had tilted in the paper metropolis. "Now, it's medication time, and then rest. City planners need their sleep." After Nathan had taken his evening medications and fallen asleep, Blake joined Sophia on the apartment balcony. Despite the cold, they'd made a habit of sharing these moments wrapped in heavy blankets, watching the Minnesota night while discussing Nathan's progress. "Dr. Larson was encouraged by today's results," Sophia said, her breath forming clouds in the cold air. "The new cells are grafting better than expected." Blake nodded, relief washing through him. "Did she give any timeline for the next phase?" "Another 6 weeks of close monitoring, then possible transition to outpatient if all continues well." Sophia pulled her blanket tighter. She asked about our living arrangements when we returned to Boston. The question hung between them. Their forced proximity over these months had created an unexpected intimacy, not romantic, but something equally powerful. They'd become partners in Nathan's care, developing routines and understanding that transcended their complicated past. "I've been thinking about that," Blake said carefully. "The penthouse at Beacon Hill has plenty of space for Nathan. The second, Master's Suite, would give you privacy when he stays with me. And it's only 15 minutes from your place in Cambridge." Sophia studied him. "You're suggesting shared custody." "To start with. The legal documents are drafted but flexible." Blake had learned to approach these conversations differently over the past months. What matters is what works best for Nathan. and what works best for you, Blake. When we return to Boston, you'll go back to Reynolds Development's board meetings, investor dinners, the all-consuming schedule that made relationships impossible. There was no accusation in her tone, only practical concern. I won't go back to that life exactly as it was, Blake said with a certainty that surprised even him. These months have shown me what I was missing. Nathan will remain my priority. Sophia seemed to consider his words carefully. People don't change fundamentally, Blake. We just become more clearly ourselves over time. Sometimes we become what we've forgotten we are, he countered, thinking of his grandfather's vision for Reynolds Developments, a vision he was beginning to reclaim through the Wellington redesign. Before Sophia could respond, Blake's phone rang with Howard Mitchell's emergency tone. I need to take this, he apologized, stepping back into the apartment. We have a situation, Howard said without preamble. The Historical Preservation Board is challenging some aspects of the Wellington redesign. They've scheduled an emergency hearing for Monday. Blake frowned. What specifically are they objecting to? The commercial space allocation near the Oak Grove. They've uncovered documents suggesting your grandfather intended that area to remain entirely public space in perpetuity. Send me everything they've found, Blake instructed. I'll need to review the original covenants. Blake, this needs your presence in Boston, Howard emphasized. The board responds to personal relationships, and you've built credibility with them through the revised approach, without you there to negotiate directly. The implication was clear. Millions of dollars and months of work hung in the balance. 6 months ago, Blake would have been on a plane within the hour, regardless of any personal commitments. I'll video conference in, Blake decided firmly. Nathan has important test results coming tomorrow, and I promised I'd be there when he meets with Dr. Larson. Howard's surprise was evident even over the phone. Blake, the Wellington project is the company's future. The board is already questioning your extended absence. Then they can continue questioning it, Blake replied with unexpected calm. Family comes first, Howard. We'll make the video conference work. After ending the call, Blake found Sophia watching him from the balcony doorway. You heard, he stated, rather than asked. Enough. She studied him with an unreadable expression. The old Blake would already be booking a flight. The old Blake had different priorities. He returned to the balcony, looking out at the snow-covered landscape. I've been reviewing my grandfather's journal since you mentioned him. There was a page marked from 1962 about the Wellington district. He wrote that a developer builds structures, but a visionary builds communities. I've spent years focusing on the structures. Sophia joined him at the railing. The Preservation Board is right, isn't it? About that section of land? Blake nodded. Technically, yes, but there's a solution that honors his intent while still making the project viable. I just need to convince the board to see it. Like, you convinced me, Sophia said softly. You weren't convinced. You collaborated. Blake turned to face her. That's the difference I've been learning. A comfortable silence settled between them, broken only when Blake's phone chimed with incoming documents from Howard. I should review these tonight, he said reluctantly. I'll make coffee, Sophia offered. Nathan's sleeping soundly. We can work in the living room. Until 4 in the morning, they pored over historical documents, property records, and the original Wellington plans created by Theodore Reynolds. What began as Blake's problem gradually transformed into a shared project, with Sophia's community perspective complementing Blake's development expertise. There, Sophia said finally, pointing to a hand-drawn sketch dated 1963. That's our answer. Your grandfather designed the commercial spaces to encircle and support the public garden, not overshadow it. If we shift the retail component here and reconfigure the residential units to face inward toward the green space, Blake quickly adapted the digital plans on his tablet. Creating a community courtyard effect, the historical board would get their preserved space. We maintain the project's financial viability, and the community gets a central gathering place. Exactly what your grandfather intended, Sophia confirmed, her voice tired but satisfied. Blake looked up from the tablet to find her watching him with an expression he hadn't seen in years, something like the admiration she'd shown when they first met before ambition and disagreements had eroded their connection. "What?" he asked, just wondering what Theodore Reynolds would think of his grandson right now. "Probably that I'm slow to learn the obvious," Blake admitted with a wry smile. "Better late than never," Sophia countered, gathering the scattered papers. "We should get some sleep. Nathan's appointment is at 9. The following morning brought life-changing news. Dr. Larson's tests confirmed that Nathan's body was accepting the new cells, with his blood count steadily improving. The experimental treatment was working better than they'd dared hope. "We're not declaring victory yet," Dr. Larson cautioned, "but these results are extremely promising. If this trajectory continues, Nathan could transition to outpatient monitoring within weeks, not months." In the clinic garden that afternoon, Nathan proudly showed his city model to Dr. Larson, while Blake and Sophia stood nearby, processing the hopeful prognosis. "I never let myself imagine this moment," Sophia confessed quietly. "I was so afraid to hope." Blake gently took her hand, a gesture that had become natural during their time in Rochester. "Hope looks good on both of you." That evening, after successfully video conferencing with the historical board and reaching a tentative agreement on the Wellington modifications, Blake found Sophia on the balcony again, staring thoughtfully at the city lights. "Nathan's asleep," he reported, joining her. "He insisted on reworking his city model based on Dr. Larson's suggestions." Sophia smiled. "Stubborn and detail-oriented. I wonder where he gets that." "I can't imagine," Blake replied dryly, then hesitated before continuing. "Sophia, when we return to Boston, I've been thinking about more than just custody arrangements." She turned to face him, her expression cautious. "Blake, not what you're thinking," he clarified quickly. "Or maybe partly what you're thinking, but that's for later, if ever. What I want to propose is a professional partnership." "Professional?" Her surprise was evident. "The Wellington project has shown me something important. Reynolds Developments has been missing the community perspective that you bring. I'd like to create a new division focused on sustainable community integration, with you heading it." Sophia stared at him. "You're serious?" "Completely. Independent authority, separate budget, your own team. You'd report directly to me as CEO, but with considerable autonomy. Working with my former," she gestured vaguely between them. "Co-parent," Blake supplied. "Colleague, friend, I hope." He held her gaze. "The personal complications exist regardless, Sophia, but together we could transform how development happens in Boston. Your vision, my resources." Sophia turned back to the city view, considering his offer. "Nathan would see us working together." "He would," Blake agreed. "He'd also see us respecting each other's strengths, compromising when necessary, and creating something meaningful." For several minutes, Sophia remained silent, and Blake didn't press. He'd learned patience in Rochester, the value of waiting for the right moment rather than forcing immediate outcomes. "I'd need certain guarantees," she said finally. "Written commitments to affordable housing percentages, green space requirements, community involvement processes." "Draft the terms yourself," Blake offered immediately. "I'll sign what's reasonable." Sophia turned to him with the hint of a smile. "And who determines what's reasonable?" "We negotiate in good faith," Blake replied, "like we did last night with the Wellington plans." A cold breeze swept across the balcony, and Sophia shivered slightly. Without thinking, Blake adjusted the blanket around her shoulders, his hand lingering for a moment. "5 months ago, I would have said this was impossible," she said quietly. "Working with you, trusting you with Nathan, considering a future where you're a daily presence in our lives. 5 months ago, it probably was impossible," Blake acknowledged. "We both needed to change." "Nathan changed us," Sophia corrected gently. "Nathan revealed us," Blake countered, "the people we could be if we were brave enough." As they stood together in the Minnesota night, the unspoken question of their personal relationship hovered between them. Neither was ready to address it directly, but for the first time in 6 years the possibility existed, tentative, fragile, but real. The video conference chime from Blake's laptop interrupted the moment. Howard Mitchell was calling with an update from the historical board meeting. "I should take this," Blake said reluctantly. Sophia nodded. "I'll check on Nathan." As they moved back into the warmth of the apartment, their paths diverging temporarily toward different responsibilities, both recognized that something fundamental had shifted. The Rochester interlude, born of crisis and necessity, had become a crucible for transformation neither could have anticipated. 1 year to the day after Blake first spotted Sophia and Nathan at the Harborview Cafe, he found himself standing in the same spot, watching the same table. This time, however, he wasn't an outsider looking in. Nathan waved enthusiastically from the cafe patio, beckoning him to join them. "Dad, we ordered your coffee already," Nathan called, his voice strong and clear in the crisp autumn air. The word Dad still created a warm surge in Blake's chest. It had been Nathan's decision, 6 weeks after their return from Rochester, to transition from Mr. Reynolds to Dad. The moment remained one of Blake's most treasured memories. "Sorry I'm late," Blake said, joining them at the table. The Wellington District ribbon cutting ran long. Half the city council wanted to make speeches. Sophia smiled, sliding his coffee across the table. Perils of success. The Boston Globe is calling it the most innovative urban development in the city's history. "The community gardens look amazing," Nathan added proudly. "My class is going on a field trip there next week." Blake settled into his chair, taking in the sight before him. Nathan had recovered remarkably in the months since their return from the Mayo Clinic. His cheeks had filled out, color had returned to his face, and his energy had rebounded to typical 5-year-old levels. The monthly checkups showed continued improvement, with Dr. Peters, Nathan's Boston specialist, cautiously optimistic about his long-term prognosis. "I have something for you," Blake said, retrieving a small box from his jacket pocket. "A ribbon-cutting tradition." Nathan opened the box to find a miniature brass key. "Is this or the ceremonial key to Wellington Community Square?" Blake confirmed. "As the junior design consultant, you earned it." Nathan beamed, holding the key reverently. Several of his suggestions for the children's area had been incorporated into the final design, a fact that filled him with immense pride. "Speaking of Wellington," Sophia said, "Marisol from the Community Council called. The Garden Committee wants to name the Oak Grove section after your grandfather. Theodore would have..." "Like that," Blake acknowledged, still adjusting to the idea of his corporate legacy being rewritten. The past year had transformed not just Blake personally, but Reynolds Developments as a company. The Wellington District project, once envisioned as luxury condominiums and high-end retail, had evolved into a mixed-use development that preserved historical elements while creating affordable housing and community spaces. The project's success had attracted attention from cities nationwide seeking similar revitalization approaches. "Are you ready for your presentation this afternoon?" Blake asked Sophia. She nodded, though a hint of nervousness showed in her eyes. "The sustainability proposal is solid. Whether the board will approve the additional investment is another question." "They will," Blake assured her. True to his word, Blake had created the Community Integration Division within Reynolds Developments upon their return from Rochester, with Sophia as its director. The transition hadn't been without challenges. Board members questioned her qualifications given her history of opposing their projects, while Sophia's former activist colleagues accused her of selling out. Yet over months of determined work, she had proven her value to both camps, developing innovative approaches that served community needs while maintaining profitability. "Mom's going to convince them," Nathan said confidently, dipping a cookie into his hot chocolate. "She always does." Blake and Sophia exchanged an amused glance over their son's head. Nathan's unwavering faith in both his parents had become a source of both comfort and pressure. Neither wanted to let him down. "How's the penthouse renovation coming along?" Sophia asked, changing the subject. "Final inspections tomorrow," Blake replied. "Nathan's room is completely finished. After months of careful negotiation and planning, Blake and Sophia had settled into a co-parenting arrangement that gave Nathan stability while respecting their separate lives. Nathan lived primarily with Sophia in Cambridge, but spent 3 nights each week at Blake's newly renovated Beacon Hill penthouse. The renovation had transformed the formerly minimalist space into a welcoming home with Nathan's architectural interests prominently featured. "Can we still have pizza night on Friday?" Nathan asked, his attention suddenly diverted by this important matter. "Absolutely," Blake confirmed. "I've already ordered the ingredients for Build Your Own Pizza Night. And Mom's coming too, right?" Nathan looked between his parents expectantly. Another shared glance passed between Blake and Sophia, more complex this time. Their personal relationship had evolved cautiously since returning from Rochester. Professional collaboration had come more easily than navigating their personal history and uncertain future. Weekly family dinners had started as Nathan's request, but had gradually become something they both looked forward to. "I'll be there," Sophia assured him, checking her watch. "But now we need to head to your piano lesson, and I need to finalize my presentation." As Nathan gathered his things, Blake's phone chimed with a message from Howard Mitchell. "The international investors are waiting in the conference room." Blake read aloud, "Apparently they arrived early." "The Singapore group?" Sophia asked. "They're crucial for the Affordable Housing Fund." Blake nodded. "I'll head there directly. Good luck with your presentation, though you won't need it." "Good luck with yours too," Sophia replied. "Remember, they care about legacy projects, not just quarterly returns." "I remember," Blake assured her. "We're speaking the same language now." As Sophia and Nathan prepared to leave, Nathan suddenly looked between his parents with the directness that often caught them off guard. "Are you two going to get married again?" Blake nearly choked on his coffee while Sophia froze mid-motion, her eyes wide. "We were never married before, Nathan," Sophia explained carefully. "I know that," Nathan said, with the exasperated patience of a child explaining something obvious to adults. "But you like each other again now, I can tell." Before either could formulate a response, Nathan continued, "It's okay if you're not ready yet. Ms. Abernathy says relationships take work and communication and compromise." He pronounced the last word carefully, clearly quoting his school. "Counselor, Ms. Abernathy is very wise," Blake managed, catching Sophia's eye over Nathan's head. The mixture of amusement, embarrassment, and something deeper in her expression mirrored his own feelings. After Sophia and Nathan departed, Blake remained at the cafe table for a moment, contemplating how completely his life had transformed in a single year. The corporate titan who once measured success solely by profit margins and square footage now found himself equally invested in his son's piano progress and Sophia's presentation to the board later that afternoon. As Blake concluded his meeting with the Singapore investors, Howard Mitchell pulled him aside. "The board approved Sophia's sustainability initiative unanimously," Howard reported. "She was remarkably persuasive." Blake smiled. "I'm not surprised." "The company is changing, Blake," Howard observed, not for the first time. "Some of the old guard are still adjusting to the new direction." "They'll adapt or retire," Blake replied without concern. "The results speak for themselves. Our community-integrated approach is attracting investment and talent we couldn't access before." Howard nodded thoughtfully. "Your grandfather would have approved, I think." "I know he would," Blake agreed. "It took me too long to understand what he was building. Not just properties, but relationships, communities." As Blake packed his briefcase to leave, his phone chimed with a message from Sophia. "Presentation approved. Nathan wants to celebrate. Dinner at Giovanni's, 7 p.m.? Blake smiled as he typed his reply. "I'll be there." Leaving the office earlier than had once been his habit, Blake decided to walk to the restaurant, taking a route that passed through the Wellington district. The autumn afternoon had turned golden, casting a warm glow over the newly completed development. Residents strolled through the central plaza. Children played in the custom-designed playground that incorporated Nathan's suggestions, and the preserved oak grove stood majestic at the heart of it all. Blake paused at the community garden, where a bronze plaque now honored Theodore Reynolds. His grandfather's vision, nearly forgotten for decades, had been revitalized and expanded, not erased or replaced, but evolved for a new era. As he continued toward the restaurant, Blake reflected on Nathan's startling question about marriage. The boy's perceptiveness was sometimes unnerving. He had indeed noticed the gradual shift in his parents' relationship. The professional partnership had slowly expanded to include lingering conversations after meetings, weekend outings that weren't explicitly for Nathan's benefit, and moments of connection that hinted at possibilities neither was ready to name. At Rouet, Giovanni's Blake found Sophia and Nathan already seated at a corner table, Nathan animatedly describing his piano lesson. Blake slid into the empty chair, immediately drawn into their conversation as though he'd been there all along. "I told Mom about the key," Nathan said between bites of breadstick. "She said maybe we could put it in a special frame with a picture of the three of us at Wellington Square." "That's an excellent idea," Blake agreed, catching Sophia's eye with a smile. As dinner progressed, Blake observed how naturally they had fallen into family rhythms. Sophia anticipating Nathan's preference for extra cheese, Blake automatically ordering the tiramisu they would all share, Nathan's stories weaving their separate days into a shared experience. When Nathan excused himself to examine the restaurant's elaborate fish tank, Sophia turned to Blake with a thoughtful expression. "About Nathan's question earlier," she began. "Kids say the most unexpected things," Blake offered diplomatically. "They do," Sophia agreed, "but sometimes they see things more clearly than we do." She hesitated. "We've been so careful not to complicate our co-parenting arrangement with other considerations." Blake studied her face, trying to read her intent. It seemed prudent given our history. "It was," she acknowledged. "Is," she corrected herself, then sighed. "Blake, I don't know what we're doing exactly. We're colleagues and co-parents and friends, and sometimes—" She trailed off. "Sometimes more," he suggested quietly. "Sometimes different," she amended. "Something we haven't been before." Blake nodded slowly. "I've been thinking about that too. We're not who we were 6 years ago, or even 1 year ago." "No, we're not," Sophia agreed. "You've become someone I never expected, someone who looks beyond the bottom line, who puts Nathan first without hesitation, who listens to community concerns with genuine interest. And you've become someone who understands business constraints, who finds creative compromises instead of just opposition, who trusts me with our son," Blake countered gently. They fell silent as Nathan returned, chattering about the exotic fish. The conversation shifted to lighter topics, but something had changed, an unspoken acknowledgement of possibilities that had previously remained carefully unexamined. After dinner, as they walked together through the Boston evening, Nathan ran ahead to examine a street performers display, giving his parents a moment of privacy. "Friday's pizza night," Blake said casually, "but perhaps Saturday just the two of us could have dinner," Sophia supplied when he hesitated. "Or lunch," Blake suggested, "or coffee, whatever feels comfortable." Sophia considered this for a moment. "Dinner," she decided. "There's that new place on Newbury Street." "I'll make a reservation," Blake agreed, careful to keep his tone casual despite the significance of the moment. As Nathan rejoined them, Blake realized they had automatically walked to Harborview Cafe, the very place where their reconnection had begun 1 year earlier. The cafe was closed now, its windows dark, but the table where he'd first spotted Sophia and Nathan remained visible on the patio. "Can we go there for breakfast tomorrow?" Nathan asked, following his father's gaze. "They have the best hot chocolate." "We have our morning meeting with the Providence developers," Sophia reminded Blake. "Let's reschedule it," Blake suggested, surprising her. "Family breakfast seems more important." Sophia's expression softened. "The great Blake Reynolds rescheduling business for breakfast?" "Theodore Reynolds' grandson," Blake corrected with a smile, remembering what actually matters. As they stood together outside the cafe where their story had restarted, Blake thought about blueprints, not just for buildings but for lives. How they could be drawn with careful precision, yet still require adjustments when reality intervened. How the most successful designs incorporated flexibility, allowed for growth, embraced the unexpected. 1 year ago, He'd been a man who measured success in square footage and profit margins. Now he understood that real success was measured differently, in Nathan's laughter, in Sophia's grudging respect that had evolved into something deeper, in communities that flourished because someone cared about more than just their monetary value. The blueprint of Blake Reynolds' life had been fundamentally redrawn, and as he walked through the Boston evening with his son racing ahead and Sophia beside him, he knew with absolute certainty that the new design was infinitely better than the original.